Welcome to the Decoupler request tutorial for the Godot game engine. In this tutorial we will be setting up a quick example on how to use Decoupler to broadcast events to request information from listeners. We will start a new project with Decoupler installed and registered in the project auto-load settings. Please refer to the Decoupler Quick Start tutorial or browse the README file in the Decoupler folder for information on how to do this. Let's start by creating a new scene with the root of type node. Add a child node to the root with the type node as well. Rename this new node listeners. This node will be the manager of all our listener nodes created in this scene. Add a child node to the listeners node, also of type node. Rename this new node listener. Save the listener node branch as a new scene and then open the scene. Attach a script to the listener scene. Set two variables for the name and value of this listener. Switch back to the root scene and delete the new listener node. We will instantiate listeners through code, so we do not need this listener anymore. Select the root node and attach a script. In the ready method, tell Decoupler to broadcast a create listeners event. Select the listeners node and attach a script. Create a variable for the listener scene that will preload when the scene is ready. In the script's ready method, tell Decoupler to listen for create listeners event and register the trigger to this script using the self keyword. Set up a trigger method named create listeners. Note that we do not expect any parameters to be passed in this event, so we will just use a default parameter named args of type variant. Create some code to generate 10 listeners by instantiating the listener scene. Set the name and value variables of the listener scene and add the scene as a child to the listeners node. Play the scene and set it as the default. When the scene starts, the root node will broadcast a create listeners event, which is then heard by the listeners node. The listeners node will then create 10 new listener nodes based on the listener scene. If you switch to the remote tab for the scene, you can see these new nodes as children of the listeners node. Let's add some code in the listener script to listen to Decoupler for events of type request info. The request info event does not have any parameters, so we will just use args with a type of variant. This trigger method will return a dictionary structure back to the sender, so we will set the return type of dictionary. Switch back to the root node script. In the script's input method, poll for input, specifically when the user types the R key on the keyboard. If that key is pressed, tell Decoupler to broadcast a request for information. A broadcast request will return an array of values, so we will store the result of the broadcast in an array called infos. Note that when requesting information using broadcast, we have to use the await keyword. This allows Decoupler to handle asynchronous information if necessary. Play the scene and press the R keyboard key. Note that in the project output, you will see the results of the broadcast from the root node. Let's now tell our listener script to listen to events named request first value. As before, we will use the default parameter of args of type variant in our trigger method. The result of the method will be a float value, so we just pass back the value of my value. In our root script, poll for input from the keyboard, telling Decoupler to broadcast the request first value event if the F key is pressed. This time we are using the Decoupler method broadcast get first result to only receive information from the first listener that responds. Note that the results of this method is a single value, not an array. Play the scene and press the F keyboard key. The project output will display the value of the first listener that responds. Now let's change the listener's script by adjusting the parameter of the request info trigger method to be named filter with a type of float. Add some code to check if the listener's myValue variable is less than the filter. If it is, then return an empty dictionary. In the root script, add a float parameter to the request info broadcast to send out a filter value of 50. Modify the code to only show results where the dictionary is not empty. When we play the scene and press the R keyboard key, only the listeners that had values greater than or equal to 50 will be displayed. Using Decoupler to request information from other nodes allows you to get information about the state of your game without having to worry about dependencies. One powerful application of this is that you can easily set up test nodes that return known results until you have a fully working system. Another possible application is that you can have a node that acts as a database, retrieving information for your other nodes without those nodes having to know where the database is or how to connect to it. A third possibility is for managers and factories to query the state of enemies, pieces, players, or any other node, updating the game state as necessary. Hopefully you can find many uses for Decoupler information requests within your own projects. Happy coding!